Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to today's webinar. We have a great presentation lined up for you today, but before we get started, there are just a few general admin points to cover. First and foremost, please use the online question tool to post any questions that you have, and we will share them with our speakers. Second, if you experience any technical difficulties today, please let us know in that same questions tool, and a member of our admin team will be on hand to support you. And finally, just to note, today's session is being recorded and we'll be sharing a copy with you all via email in the coming days. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our speakers to get us started.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to this new episode of the Privacy Made Positive series. So today I'm very happy to be with Ben again, and we'll talk about why privacy transparency is an opportunity and should not be seen as a burden by organizations. So we'll go over a few interesting results out of the Privacy Made Positive surveys and discuss this very interesting topic that carries a lot of value for all organizations out there. So before we get started, let me just briefly introduce myself. I'm Romain Gauthier, co-founder of Didomi. Didomi is a European company specialized in consent and preference management. So we help companies with solutions to collect, store, and make their consents and preferences effective for themselves, for the tools they're using, basically wherever data processing are being done. And we've been there doing that for the past 4 years and are happily helping a lot of different organizations collecting, storing, and distributing consents and preferences in a number of verticals. So we have some real life experience about what is privacy transparency, how do you make sure your customers understand and agree to what you're doing with their personal data. And we are actually passionate about these questions, which I think personally is a critical one for all organizations out there. And today I'm with Ben. Ben, I'll let you introduce yourself and Securys.
Thanks, Romain. So I'm Ben Rapp. I'm principal at Securus. We are a privacy consulting firm operating globally. We take a slightly different view to lots of consulting firms. We have a lot of legal background, but our function is to deliver practical and actionable advice. And our focus is on helping you build trust, which is why we started the Privacy Made Positive initiative. So Romain, if we can go to the next slide, I'll talk a bit about what that initiative means. We did Privacy Made Positive because of this belief that privacy is really a trust issue. It's not just a compliance activity. It's not a back office function. It's something that primarily drives your commercial relationships. The first thing we did was a lot of research into the existing work that had been done. We paid an economics firm to go and look over the body of research, and there's an ebook for that you can get from privacymadepositive.com. And we're going to talk a bit about some of the findings from that research last year in the first half of this presentation today. What we were looking at there was the general picture around ethical behavior by companies and how that affects their interaction with consumers and employees. We then went out in February of this year to about 4,000 consumers across Europe to ask them how they behaved in the context of privacy. We wanted to go beyond how they felt and look at what they've done. And that's really the new research that we're bringing to the table. It looks at how your organization's privacy posture and behavior affects how consumers perceive you and then how they behave commercially, whether they buy from you or not. We're carrying on with that research. We're going to expand it to the US in the latter half of this year. We're also going to do some work on how employees are affected by employer privacy. And then in 2022, we're going to close the loop, if you like, by looking at how investors perceive it and how much privacy contributes to the S and G parts of ESG. Romain, should we move on? Great. This is our mission statement. And this is, as I said, this is why we did Privacy Made Positive. And I think it's just really important to reiterate how much we think privacy is a positive value that contributes to your organization's bottom line. If you go and look at the phase 1 research from last year, we have really good evidence that ethical businesses do better than businesses that don't have ethics as an externally perceived core operating value. And privacy is a part of that. And so that trust that you build with all of your stakeholders is a significant part of your organization's success. It's not just about avoiding regulatory action.
Thank you, Ben. So let's dive into the survey results, but maybe before we get started, I invite everyone to ask questions in the chatter. We'll have some time at the end of the presentation to go through your questions and try to answer them. So feel free to ask questions in the chatter, and we'll take them at the end. Great. Let's start with like initial set of results that I think are worth mentioning. So the first one is obviously not news for anyone probably around the table here, but regulation is clearly something that is widespread. So everybody thinks about Europe when they talk about privacy, but actually what we are seeing is that it's a global trend, and that even in countries like China, where we would never have imagined that they could end up regulating privacy, they are actually doing it at the moment, and in a pretty serious way, and in a way that organizations should clearly pay attention to. But it's just one example out of many, and as a company having clients in over 30 countries, we are seeing that almost on a daily basis. So regulations are really being initiated all around the world around the topic of privacy, because essentially I think citizens have clearly mandated their representatives all over the world to regulate technology for preserving their privacy. So I think that's something that as an organization you should clearly pay attention to and think deeply, because it can affect your business in ways that can be serious. We have clients that have seen a revenue drop because of privacy matters, and so that's something you prefer to anticipate if possible.
Quite. I mean, I think I very much second that. We're active globally. We've got a lot of customers across Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa, as well as the US, in addition, of course, to Europe. And we're seeing two things. One is that there is a virtuous circle. So regulation drives consumer awareness, and then consumer awareness drives both enforcement and further regulation. So privacy, once it gets started, is something of a snowball. And I think we're seeing that in the US at the moment, as we're beginning to see both state privacy laws being passed and also increasing likelihood of a federal privacy law. We've certainly seen it in Latin America, where there was a rush of privacy regulation and now some proper enforcement happening. The thing we find interesting is that it's not just being led by consumers, it's also being led by employees. A lot of our work is with very large organizations on employee privacy. And in those countries where there has been recent transition to enforcement of privacy regulation, you're seeing employees taking advantage of that and being alert to it. South Africa is a very good example of that, where we're starting to see both employees and associations, trade unions, and people like that being very privacy alert. So it's a big part of how your relationship with all of these stakeholders works. And now that it's very much a global phenomenon, there isn't really anywhere to hide, but there's also an enormous opportunity for people who want to take early advantage of that consumer and employee awareness.
Right, I think it's almost a question of leadership. So, like, you want to lead these type of initiatives, seizing the opportunity of being compliant at the same time as a kind of a side benefit of investing in privacy. What we are also seeing at the same time is that it's hard. Like it's a hard task. It's a hard job, because at the moment, winning consumer trust is hard, as it's really well framed in this title. Institutions in general suffer from mistrust. So it's true for companies, it's true for probably any institutions out there, and you have to work hard to win trust. So, but I think where there is novelty is that getting your customer to trust your product is not enough to build a strong reputation for your brand. a strong relationship with your customers. So having good products is not enough, and a lot of organizations, I think, underestimate that. There is a new component in the customer relationship, which is, what the hell are you doing with my data? And there, I think it's a question that companies have really neglected over the years. They have neglected to seriously frame this question, to really think about it from a strategic standpoint, and also to fix it. So that there are a number of abuses that have emerged around the personal data because of this lack of attention. And so the main force, the main driver of change with regulations is that it's putting pressure on organizations to really work on that key question. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting opportunity in general, but also one that is hard to really apprehend as an organization.
Quite. I think one of the interesting things we found, and this is Salesforce's research, but if you go to Privacy Made Positive and get the phase 2 ebook, you can see our research into consumer awareness and their general feelings around privacy as an issue. And the age profiling of it is very interesting. I think we observed two things. One is that a greater proportion of younger people are very concerned about the use of their data than you might expect, particularly millennials, who are commonly thought of as not caring. This isn't true. But also that as people age, they become more concerned. And you can track that by looking at longitudinal surveys over time. It's not just generational, it's to do with what you have at risk. And of course, the older you get, the more money you have, and therefore, to some extent, the more valuable you are as a customer. So the fact that privacy as a component of trust becomes more important to you is a sign that, particularly if you're chasing older consumers, you really have to put it front and center.
Right, and where I think companies need to work extra hard is that there is clearly a disconnection between what they think they are doing and what their consumers understand and appreciate. So I find these figures very, very interesting and insightful, because even if you think you are doing a great job, I think it's not necessarily obvious for your customers. And this gap is also kind of expanding. If you look at the figure, the percentage of consumer who estimates that you're doing a worse job, so their assessment decreased over time, is 30%, and this is significant. So like for a large portion of your consumers, the gap is expanding, and so for me, there should be almost a sense of emergency. Companies always think of emergency as coming from data breach scandals, DPA fines, but actually I think it's a clear indicator that there is also an emergency coming from the customer base. So I think DPA fines and scandals are kind of the tip of the iceberg, and there is kind of an invisible drama happening in these figures. So have you really looked at your bounce rate, at your engagement rate, and is there not a factor explaining like the drops in some of your analytics because of privacy? I think it's a question that some organizations are starting to understand and to start measuring, but clearly a very interesting angle to look at your privacy program as well, is that it's not only about getting to compliance and be happy with your work internally. It's also first and foremost about asking your consumers if this makes any sense.
Yes, I think there are a lot of moving parts in this, and it's a very interesting piece of analysis to dive into. We won't do it in great depth here. Two things that we've observed. One is that there is a disconnect between what organizations think constitutes improving privacy performance and what consumers think. We were looking at an e-commerce business that had recently revised its privacy policy and were feeling very pleased with themselves. And we pointed out that the privacy policy in question, this is the public one on the website, was 27,500 words long, which means it's a privacy policy that literally no one is going to read. And as a result, rather than building trust, what you create is the impression that you're trying to hide something because you have an unreadably long document. So there's a part of this which is about understanding how consumers perceive your actions. And then, of course, there's context. So if consumers are seeing a lot of enforcement action and they're reading about breaches and they're reading about abuses of data in the press, they're instinctively going to trust no one, and you therefore have to work harder to set yourself apart from the run of the mill and to really show yourself to be a privacy beacon. And I think we can find examples. Apple is perhaps the most obvious, but also Strava. There are a few e-commerce and plain commerce players who are clearly trying to use privacy as a distinguishing mark. And that's part of what we're hoping to encourage, because we think for those people who move first, they will see a real competitive advantage.
Absolutely, and so overall, we can take a few nuggets out of these first slides. Consumers are more concerned than ever about what is done with their data, and they really perceive brands as having improved their care. They don't perceive brands as having improved their care over data, which is a big problem, because all the investments in privacy programs are not really valued by consumers to the level they should. So it's indicating probably that the approach taken by organizations was probably not the right one. And that privacy is a growing issue, because technology is just prevalent. Every business is currently being rebuilt over data, big data, and algorithms. So consumers perceive that and are worried about that, because they are really worried about what they don't understand and what they don't control. So something that I think should be at the heart of any good privacy program. What we are going to focus now is about the impact over the customer journey. So in terms of the purchasing decision, in terms of actual business being driven through the right privacy programs. There are some very interesting insights coming out of the survey, and so we'll dive a bit deeper in the results. The first interesting results that stand out of the survey is that privacy precedes purchasing. So it's clearly one aspect of the purchasing decision and process that is playing a large role across the countries that we've surveyed. What we can see if we dig a bit deeper is that there is France standing out. So it's interesting to see that one of the most active data protection authority, the most vocal one, the one having issued a lot of fines, warnings, and in a very public and mediatic fashion, drives consumers to pay a lot more attention to privacy than probably they did before, and especially before making a purchase. What also I found interesting in the results is that actually very few people do not care about privacy, which is clearly showing that it's a massive concern, and one that spans across a number of age categories and household categories, and so something that from a marketing standpoint, from a customer relationship standpoint, should be the focus for any organization.
Thanks, Romain. I mean, this is, as Romain said, I mean, this is one of the really interesting findings from our new research in February. The volume of people who think about privacy as a contributor to their purchasing decision is much higher than we expected. Cisco had a number of about a third of people of what are called privacy actives, but we're seeing north of 70% of people paying at least some attention to privacy, and anywhere up to 40% paying a great deal, which I think is a significant change, and isn't, I think, entirely a surprise when you set it in the context of some of the scandals that happened over the last few years, but is an indicator to us that people's interaction, probably not with the privacy policy that's buried at the bottom of your website, probably much more with what you have publicly said about privacy. If you think about those organizations that really wave the flag for privacy as a core ethical value, that I think is really where this is coming from. What was interesting for me, you won't see this in these slides, but if you go and get the book, you can find all the detail, was that the age distribution is nothing like as dramatically different as you might expect. Yes, it's true that Gen Zs in particular pay slightly less attention, but you're talking about 20% paying a great deal of attention as opposed to around about 25%. It's not a massive gap. So this applies to consumers across all age groups. It's relatively speaking balanced between genders, appears that women care slightly more than men. And as you can see, it's pretty uniformly distributed across countries as well. So certainly within a European context, we've got good evidence that privacy is a contributory factor in real purchasing decisions.
Yeah, and if we go a bit deeper, we can see that looking at the numbers that privacy adds value. So it's a way of saying that for some people, and actually a fairly large number of your customers, in between 35 to 40%, are willing to pay more to get a more private experience or a more private product or service, which also I think is completely is a new way of looking at privacy as a real business opportunity, where it could be a dimension of your product or service that is differentiating you from the competition. So we always think about Apple, but I think it's true for any connected device. If you're going to buy a smartwatch monitoring your heart rate, your location, and every like inbound calls that you're receiving, what is the level of privacy you'd like to have, and are you willing to pay a bit more to get this type of data private? I think the obvious answer is yes, and so for some people it's a critical element of the purchasing decision. But this applies to in my opinion, to pretty much any product and services, because there is always some form of data being used and processed as part of your experience as a consumer. So the way I like to look at it is a bit like nutrition labels. So for a lot of people, the nutrition labels are the #1 reason why they buy a product versus another, and sometimes it makes them buy more pricey products, more expensive products, and to pay a premium to get the right form of a nutrition score or element that is relevant for them. Privacy has the same kind of attributes, I think, so it can really sell for a premium, and that's what we see in these survey results.
Thanks, Romain. I think there are a number of different ways to make use of this information. And again, if you get the ebook, you'll see that it's pretty much evenly distributed by age as well as by country. So this is not a feature of one age group. One way to look at it is about your sources of revenue, and the fact that it's clear that there is a group of people who are prepared to pay for example, an ad-free experience. They would rather pay for your service than have it paid for by advertisers to whom you are selling their data. They don't want to be the product, they want you to be the product. Another is that, in terms of how we phrased the question, people were asked whether they would choose the more privacy protecting product from a range of identical products that had the same price, or where the privacy protecting product was at a greater price. And so what we're seeing is that people are going to prefer privacy protecting products, certainly where the price is the same, but also that they were prepared to pay extra. That has different implications in different jurisdictions. If you're in Europe, where there is a very high level of privacy as a basic right, this becomes about whether you can do better than that. Can you exceed the basic right? Can you go further? And can you find ways of delivering the product that are more privacy protecting? When you're talking about countries like the US, where the privacy rights are much more constrained and are predominantly around the control of sales of data and not the broader rights that you get under GDPR, there is a real opportunity, I think, for first movers to say, we have a product that matches, for example, the GDPR's standards for privacy, and you should buy that rather than our competitors because your data will be safer. And I think it's clear that there is at least a third of consumers for whom that's going to be a compelling argument, and that's a large market.
Absolutely, and to go on in that direction, what we also see out of the results is that good privacy attracts and poor privacy repels. I think that's there is a dramatic effect in getting your privacy wrong, and it shows up in the figures. So bad privacy leads people to drop their purchase, to bounce from your website or your mobile applications, to uninstall your application, to interrupt the navigation, basically like to stop looking at your content, your product. And so this is the hidden cost of privacy gone wrong, and it can be pretty massive. So at Didomi, we have invested a lot in what we call consent analytics. So the idea of looking at the data, so observing behaviors with respect to consent and preference questions, and looking at the data in a pretty broad way, and what we're seeing is pretty interesting. So you could get a pretty good consent rate, so let's say 80% consent rate, but it's just like masking the true reality of what is happening, which is that probably 80% of the people you could have discussed with have left before like saying yes or no. And so what we call bounce is an enormous factor about the contribution of your privacy program to your revenue. And so we have devised a specific analytics to bring light over this question, which we call addressability rate. So the idea that a good privacy program should not be only about understanding how many people say yes or how many people say no to a specific data processing. It should also be about how many people are actually happy with the question you've asked them, find that appropriate, find that timely, find that done in a natural way and in an informative way, and all that drives results. So like you can actually you don't care about your consent rate at all. You care about people staying on your website, buying your product, not dropping their purchase, and I think that's a focus that should be the one of any team within any commercial organization. It's truly about rethinking their customer relationship around this type of metrics. And so whether people say yes or no may not be the real question. The real question may be more about, are people satisfied? And satisfaction can come from having a good private experience, from having their choice respected, having their choice asked in the right way. And so I think that it's a field of research that we are still very early in this game. We don't understand everything. There are like local nuances that we uncover, but it's really interesting and something that as a DPO, like you could have a data-driven job and prove actual impact over your marketing colleague results. It feels great to look at this data and to see how much impact you can have by just moving some parts about your privacy program.
Absolutely, I think, and this is why this for me is the slide that justifies the research. We did Privacy Made Positive. Look, we're a commercial consulting business, so we're out there trying to get you to buy privacy consulting from us, and we recognize, particularly if you're a DPO or an internal head of privacy, that you have budget constraints. And so part of this is to enable organizations to get a wider reach internally for privacy commitment, and to take this to your marketing colleagues and say, look, actually we have an opportunity here to exploit this consumer appetite for privacy to drive our business forward, but you have to contribute to helping us build a privacy program that actually addresses consumers directly. And what you see here is the whole product life cycle. You have propensity to purchase on the left, so this is people who actively choose privacy protecting product over non-privacy or less privacy protecting product. You then have the basket abandon in the middle, where they've chosen your product, but then they find out about your privacy practices and decide not to buy it after all. And then you've got the risk of losing customers because they don't trust you, or they no longer feel that your privacy practices are acceptable. And although the headline numbers are at roughly the same level in the kind of 3/5 of consumers, there's some nuance in it. There is a hard core of about 1/5 of consumers, about 20% of people who frequently work on this basis across all three stages in the life cycle. There's about 1/5 of consumers who routinely prefer privacy protecting product over others, about 1/5 who routinely abandon when they find out that your privacy isn't as good as they hoped it was, and about 1/5 who cancel services or stop buying product if they find out that they don't like what you're doing. And then in the middle, there's this block of approximately 2/5 of people who do this occasionally. So it's where they feel their data is particularly at risk. So to some extent, it will depend on what you're doing, both in terms of the nature of your product and the nature of your data processing and what you've told people about it. But I think this is your opportunity to go to marketing and say, we have both a risk, we have 2/5 of the audience that we could lose, and we have an opportunity, we have 3/5 of the audience that we could attract if we get this right. Whereas if we continue to see privacy purely as a box ticking compliance exercise, we're not only missing out on the 3/5 that we could attract, but we risk repelling the 2/5 who routinely cancel precisely because a 27,500 word privacy policy is going to put people off rather than make them feel comfortable. So I think this for me was the kind of the heart of it from our perspective. I think we're going to move now towards some stuff that's very much at the heart of Didomi's proposition. So Romain, back to you.
Right. So what we see like across the board in all countries is that obviously like privacy has an impact on your marketing engagement. And like if you think about it, the first thing today that a European consumer sees is a privacy notice, is a consent notice about cookies, trackers, and that's the first experience, the first message is sent to a consumer. So it's like the opportunity to make your first good impression, and it happens only once. And so what we see is that the surveys are clear. What we see in our consent analytics are the outcomes are very clear. 70% of consumers are more likely to accept cookies and emails from companies with good privacy information. It may sound very logical and not very original, but I think it's worth like showing the figures and explaining to everyone that it has a strong impact. And what we see is that you can do things wrong. You cannot bet on the idea that people say they care, but they end up consenting anyway. That's not really true. You can get things wrong when we talk about consent and preferences, and it can seriously harm your consent rates overall. But not only the consent rates, the idea that people are just going to stay on your websites, on your mobile applications, keep being subscribed to your emailing programs, and so on and so forth. So really something that is really the core of your marketing engagements. It's just like as if you don't invest in that, you have one pillar of your marketing that is missing and can have catastrophic consequences. We run typically with our clients a bunch of calculations. So what is the actual value of an increase of your consent rate, of your acceptance rate, or a decrease of your unsubscription rate? And you can see that it can be massive. It represents millions of euros for marketing programs, because any like percentage of people unsubscribing over the lifetime value of a customer is massive. And so there is a clear relationship between your consent and your revenue, and so getting your people to understand, to accept what you do with their data will drive your revenue up in a significant way. Obviously, like it's something that varies from one industry to another, and the relationship between marketing engagement and privacy is sometimes more indirect than direct, but it's there, and we can see that across the board, companies investing in the UX, in the information, in the quality of their privacy information, yield interesting results, and also distinguish themselves from the competition, which yield even more results, as we saw before.
So I think, what this slide is telling us is how infrequently people currently accept marketing emails and cookies, right? And we've seen this if you look at Apple's opt-in rates. Now that they have allowed you to, or required you to opt in for tracking, the opt-in rate is somewhere between 4 and 20%, depending on who you believe. We're starting to see that impact on ad revenues for Apple users, and we know that there's another update coming that's going to make that worse or better. I mean, from a privacy professional's point of view, probably better. But if your revenues are dependent on advertising, or your marketing is dependent on opt-in, then you clearly have a challenge coming as people are forcibly given those tools. And it's really important to remember how active all European DPAs are being about opt-ins, and how many fines there've been, even in the last 3 months, for email marketing in particular without an opt-in, and to remember that there's a new e-privacy regulation eventually coming down the road, which is going to expand the opt-in regime substantially, apply it to all forms of electronic communication. There's going to be yet more pressure. There's just today extra pressure on another 40 companies to implement proper cookie controls that make reject all as easy as accept all, something with which almost everybody is still not compliant. So this risk that consumers are going to rarely or never, 15%, or only sometimes 31%, accept your email and your cookies is only going to get greater. And I think we're going to see those always and often donuts, I suppose those are, have ever smaller bites. We know that, I mean, Apple, for example, would suggest that that number becomes somewhere around the 20% bracket. So what we asked people was, first of all, how often, how likely are you to accept this stuff in a kind of neutral environment? And then the question, which we'll get to on the next slide, was, okay, if somebody is upfront and properly transparent with you about the privacy information that they provide, if they put it in front of you forcibly rather than requiring you to go and hunt for it down in some 5-click link, if it's short to the point, layered, infographic, understandable rather than tens of thousands of legalistic words, are you more likely to opt into their marketing? And the answer was overwhelmingly yes. And this is, from a marketing person's point of view, this is the killer slide, right? If you get your privacy right from a consumer's point of view, if you get the information right, if you make them trust you, then 70% of them are more likely to accept your marketing, and they're not going to buy your things if you can't market to them. That's kind of marketing 101. So what we're saying is good privacy information, which is not the same as compliant privacy information, it's a sort of superset of compliant privacy information, is something that will drive consumers to trust you and therefore has a direct impact on their engagement with you. And so this is where the pressure for reading age studies in privacy notices, layered privacy notices, sectional privacy notices that are presented at the right time in the consumer journey, proper cookie control that makes rejecting as easy as accepting, because if you provide reject and accept, people are more likely to accept because they recognize that you're offering the opportunity to reject. You're not trying to force them down the path of acceptance, and so on, and so on, and so on. So all of this has this enormous impact, this 70% impact on likelihood to engage with your marketing. And if they don't engage with your marketing, then the marketing money you're spending is wasted. So here is your argument as a privacy professional to go to marketing and say, we can actually make your budget work for you. And if you don't listen to us, it won't.
Completely agree with everything you said. I think it shows clearly that consumer behaviors vary from one website to another, from one application to another, and there are like drivers of this variation. So driving your consent rate up or down, and these are like very simple things sometimes. So consent notice can feel very intrusive and very weird. Or it can feel fairly natural and can come at the right time, and can be embedded in your overall UX in a pretty nice way, in a fun way sometimes. Like there are many variations of this idea, but it's just that as any other bit of your marketing program, of your customer relationship, it's something that is that should feel a bit unique. And people talk a lot about consent fatigue and the idea that we are solicited too much with privacy information in question. It's only true because privacy information is just so hard to understand and to digest, and so unnatural at this point, and too much connected to legal challenges rather than customer UX. And so I think the truth is in between, and as an organization, it's a topic that is worth investing in, exploring, and customizing. So making sure that your own consent experience is unique to your organization and to your customers is a good a good mirror of the overall product, service, quality, and experience that you want to offer to your customers. And there you will see the impact of these investments in a very interesting way. And so it can feel very intrusive and annoying, but at the same time, it can also feel very natural, timely, and like as Ben said, like just the simple idea of presenting a simple choice, yes or no, accept all, reject all. It's obvious, like we all as consumers prefer that type of experience, and you see that in the consent analytics that we observe. It works well to trust your customers with the right decision. People talk a lot about trust. I think that there is no such thing as trust. There are only proofs of trust, and so this is there are simple elements that you can put live on your website in your mobile applications that will be these proofs of trust and will yield results. But yeah, overall, very interesting survey that we've seen and consistent across all European countries, which confirms what we see with our clients in their consent analytics.
Romain, before we move on, just one other thing on this. Just thinking about precisely what we're saying here about the timing, particularly of presenting privacy information. There's a lovely confluence, I guess, between the principles that we are fundamentally working to, what is actually stated in the regulation, and what we've seen in consumer behavior. So the principle says, this is the principle of reasonable expectation, that you should never do anything that the data subject wouldn't reasonably expect. The regulation says you have to provide privacy information before you collect the data. And the consumer behavior says that if you put your intrusive privacy questions, your intrusive data collection after their initial engagement, so they've got to the point where they're trying to buy your product, and then they get to the next page and it says, oh, and please tell us your age, your height, your weight, your mother's maiden name, whatever it is that you're collecting for whatever reason it is. And that comes as a surprise because it wasn't intuitive to them that you would want that information. That's when they basket abandon. They get to that second or third page in the enrollment process. They discover that you're asking questions they weren't expecting and they walk away. And so turning that around and telling them in advance what questions you're going to ask and why means that when they arrive on that second or third page, they already know to expect it, and therefore they're more likely to follow through. And this is, if you like, one of the practical ways to make use of this research, is to say if you flag up in advance what you're going to do, particularly if you can demonstrate that this information is in fact necessary, you're going to see fewer abandons in your customer enrollment journey.
Yeah, like expanding on this idea, like if you look at cookies, for instance, why do every company needs to ask consent for cookies on the first page? And that's a genuine question, because what we can see at Didomi is that it should actually vary from one website to another, from one industry to another, because cookies are not necessary a necessity for all businesses. And so you should really question this idea of when is the right time to ask for this type of consent. Can you just like give access to your first page, some elements of your content, of your service, before asking for personal data? And as an organization, I think it's an authentic question you should ask to your organization, because it can yield very interesting results. So maximize your consent rate, your ability to collect personal data, customer satisfaction, and so on. And so it's something worth asking internally. Obviously, like if you're a publisher and your revenue depends on personalized advertising, that's an entirely different question. But it's not true for any business out there, and something that should really be questioned by marketers and everybody in the organization that really wants to offer the best UX to their customer, the best brand experience overall.
Yes, I think this ties back nicely also to the difference between European and US regulation. It's quite interesting, this. So in Europe, we have this attitude that says this is required by regulation, therefore we do it because it's required by regulation. There's a slight sense we want to kind of get it out of the way. In the US, because the expectation is that consumers need to see value in exchange for their personal data, there is slightly more of a tendency to convince people that that exchange of data is worth it. And I think this is another important thing to take away, that asking for the data at the right time, having already demonstrated the value of what you're doing, is better than asking for it up front before you need it. And it ties back then to the principle of necessity as well. So there are a number of what Romain would call a UX, a number of user journeys where you're asked for information well in advance of using the service, and that information isn't actually necessary until you're well into using the service, and it would be better to pick it up later. And there's some very good UXs where you can sign up providing almost nothing, and then it says, well, if you want to do this thing, you need also to provide this piece of information, and here's the justification for it and how we look after it. And that provides a much more staged journey for the user, and they get a chance to establish their trust for you and their sense of value before you demand more data from them. And I think remembering that it's a two-way street, it's an exchange of value, is another way to contextualize this user resistance.
And all that is data. So like looking at that with the data-driven approach is also very interesting. So figuring out if your audience is more privacy sensitive or not, if like how much value they put in your privacy program, like is something that is also critical in revising your UX and establishing the right approach. So something where we see a lot of very interesting initiatives at the moment, and some of our clients are pretty amazing in like thinking creatively around these questions of what means more information and more control over private information to my customers. And so we're very excited to see what will come next, and how like compliance will probably like diminish in importance, and like be some kind of will be much better accepted within organizations as like a facilitator or kind of a standard that everybody understands and builds on top of.
Absolutely. I mean, this is to the point of compliance. If you see compliance as a burden, then you approach compliance as a silo, and it becomes something you do in addition to everything else, and perhaps you do everything else despite doing compliance. If you think of privacy as a marketing tool and a selling tool, then compliance becomes a natural activity because you're simply reporting to a regulator on what you're doing anyway. And in fact, you may be doing more than the regulator demands because you want to engage that customer trust. So I think there's a strong argument for turning the whole privacy thing on its head and saying we're going to do privacy because we believe in it. We're going to do it because it's going to help us sell stuff. And then all we're going to do is explain to the regulator what we're doing, because we must be doing the right thing, because we're doing what consumers want us to do in order that they trust us. And that is the fundamental intention of the regulation. So while there will always be a degree of, if you like, legalistic work in compliance, much of it can be simplified if you set out to do the right thing in the first place.
Great. So a couple of nuggets summarizing that on this slide. Thanks a lot, Ben, for all these insights and very interesting survey results. I think we have still a bit of time for some questions. Let's see if there are a couple of questions. If you have questions, feel free to send them across. In the meantime, we are organizing with Securys again a summit early October called the Yes We Trust Summit, where we'll bring a number of very interesting thought leaders around the table and challenging our views and conceptions around privacy with different tracks around compliance, data, marketing, and tech. So obviously, feel free to look at that at Yes We Trust Summit and to register to it. It's going to be very very insightful and some very complementary content with what we presented here today.
So it's just a reminder that if you do have questions, now is the time to ask them. Otherwise, of course, if you only think of them on your way down the stairs after the meeting, what the French call esprit de l'escalier, then by all means do email them through, and either Romain or I will be happy to answer them. You can get hold of both of us through our websites, and equally our email addresses are, I think, slightly obvious. I'm very much looking forward to being part of the Yes We Trust Summit. I think it's very important to keep banging on this word trust. I know I keep using it because I really want people to understand that there is this bi-directional relationship you're trying to build. You're ultimately, and this is the whole point of the GDPR, the previous regulation or directive from '95 was a regulator-facing directive. Your job in compliance was to tell the regulator what you were up to. The big change in GDPR, remember, was the switch to transparency so that your job was to tell the data subject what you're up to. And so that transformation in regulation focus is mirrored by the opportunity in commercial focus to use that opportunity to talk to the consumer in another channel, on another topic, as a way of building trust, so that you see it as another marketing channel that is about establishing the trustworthiness, the probity of your organization, and therefore making it and your brand something consumers want to treat.
Two questions that arrive. How can DPOs encourage marketing teams to build trust into customer relationships? And second question, what brands can we use as good example?
I think we need to be slightly careful about singling. I mean, I singled out Apple, picking that one up first. We'll do them in reverse order. I singled out Apple because they clearly made a big song and dance about it. And so if you want to pick a brand that's decided to use privacy as an absolutely core marketing plank, then Apple would be it. I mean, clearly you could talk about Signal, but they're not actually a commercial brand. The other one that I mentioned was Strava, and I mentioned Strava for two reasons. Because like lots of fitness and wellness apps, they collect an enormous amount of what we would call special category data, sensitive information, height, weight, medical conditions, calorie burn, all of that stuff. And they took a position very early on that they were not going to sell that data. And so they are not ad funded, whereas most of the others are either ad funded or actually belong to larger organizations. So remember, MyFitnessPal actually belongs to Under Armour, which is a fitness clothing company. So, they have an interest in knowing about you as a marketing proposition. Strava is a pure play, and they exist to serve what they call athletes, which is wonderfully flattering for those of us who are Strava users. And they have, amongst other things, one of the best examples of a layered privacy policy that we have seen. It's very nicely laid out. It's very much front and center. It's very clearly written. And it helps to foster this idea that you can trust them with this very sensitive information. I think you've seen the same thing with Apple making a lot of noise about how difficult it is for every kind of actor, whether that's a state actor or a hacker, to get hold of your information if you use Apple's ecosystem because of how strong their encryption is. And that's a position that they've taken. And again, they've taken this view that they don't sell your data outside the Apple ecosystem. They clearly monetize it inside the Apple ecosystem, and it's your choice that you believe that adds value for you, but they're giving you much more control over the extent to which it leaves that walled garden than, say, Google do in the equivalent Android. I think that ties back to this question about how you can get your marketing team engaged. And frankly, that's what the books are for. Go and get the ebooks, go to your marketing team and say, look, companies that do privacy well make more money. Your job is to help the company make more money. How hard is this? And then work with them. I think that's the really important thing is that it's not so much DPOs actually, because the DPO has this peculiarly independent role. It's privacy offices. How can your internal privacy office do this constructively? And the answer is to not be the department of saying no, but to be the department of saying, here's how we do it. Here's how we achieve your goals in a privacy protecting way. And here's how privacy can help you hit those targets. And I think going to internal departments with the view that you're trying to help them do their job well, you're not just trying to make sure that they're good stewards of personal data, is the bridge we have to cross as privacy people. Come on.
Yeah, I think I'll just add that where I think there is an interesting opportunity is to break the idea that privacy means less data. I think it's especially for marketing, it's a different kind of data. It can mean more data, it can mean more insights, more a better understanding of consumer behaviors. So marketers are kind of blind at the moment about what their customers really think about what they are doing, and they are blinded in many ways. And I think like privacy can be like a tool to shed light on some behaviors, on some like customer journeys that can't really be explained otherwise. And so that's a very interesting tool for marketers to get equipped, to understand, to measure, and to even optimize, I think, the experience. So basically, it's not any different as another marketing initiatives. It's the same way of looking at the challenge and solving it. It's just, I think, will yield to more results, because I think there is a massive opportunity for companies seriously investing in privacy. We've seen in the survey the figures are really clear. There is a gap, a significant gap in the markets, and so means a massive opportunity for companies understanding that. Great. I think we are about on time. So thanks a lot, everyone, for your attention today. Thanks a lot, Ben, for your great insights once again. And obviously, feel free to download the full survey results on the Privacy Made Positive website or on Didomi websites. And really happy to have spent this hour with you. And see you next time for other insights. Privacy Made Positive is not over yet. We have Ben is preparing very interesting things for the second half of the year. So stay tuned.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, everybody. We look forward to seeing you at the SP Trust Summit, and we will keep you posted on developments in Privacy Made Positive, particularly our survey in the US, which we'll be very interested to see whether that has distinctly different outcomes to what we found in Europe.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Goodbye.